or whatever. This is the third and the last part of that first chapter, which is basically exploring the New World. And the text does not do a terribly good job with this, and this is a very complicated issue. I often think this is the most difficult part of the class for most students. What I'm talking about today is religion and the rise of religious differences. Most of us are not actively involved in religions. I myself am not religious. I do attend church, but off and on, I would say about half the time. I am Greek, so I am Greek Orthodox pretty much by definition. I am never, when I talk about religion in this class, talking about my religion or your religion. We are talking about religion in theory, religion in general. Why is it important to understand? For us, it is not that much, no pun intended, a burning issue, but for the people that we're talking about, this is the most important thing in their life. And of course, we all know millions of people have been slaughtered and are still being slaughtered because they are the wrong religion in the wrong place at the wrong time. I had a student write this on a paper about a year and a half ago. Why do you need to study religion? This is why. I like learning about how all the religions branched off of Catholicism. I was at Plucker's one night with my friends, and somehow the topic became religion, and I was able to just answer all the questions from off the top of my head, from the origins of the religions and the key differences between them. We were also very drunk, so I don't know how I remembered all that information. The point of that being is you never know when you might be drunk down at Plucker's and somebody starts to talk about religion. So it is very good to understand the basic differences between religion. And this is a huge part of this first half of the class. This first section is a lot of religion and a lot of botany, actually plants. Okay, so I am starting with slide 28 is the push-pull going into Europe, and then slide 29 through 35 deal with the religion. Slide 29 is an important one because it is the religious tree. I would describe religion in this period as a branching tree. If you look starting from the bottom at the root, you have Judaism. Judaism is the first and largest monotheistic religion, the belief in one God. All religions talk about God in heaven. Native Americans, of course, believed there was a supreme being of some kind, but they also had gods of mountains, gods of trees, deer gods, etc. Jews believe in one God. Remember, Jesus was a Jew to start out with. Jesus comes along and initiates Christianity. And then we date our modern period from that point, okay? So for about 1,000 years, everybody is a Christian. There is no division whatsoever. You are either a believer in Jesus or not, or something else. And about 1054, there is a major split, the first big split in the tree. If you move up, look at that tree. And the split is between the eastern and the western parts of Christianity. Originally, there was a group of archbishops who determined the theology and settled the disagreements within the church. There was one in Alexandria, there was one in Antioch in Syria, there was one in Jerusalem, there was one in Athens, there was one in Rome. I think there were 6 of them. Okay, so these guys basically directed the church. So if a new idea came along, it was their job to examine the idea and see if it could be incorporated or if it was a heresy, not part of the faith. Okay, so about 1000 AD, the Archbishop of Rome begins to get different ideas. And he begins to talk about himself. This is the historical view, not the Catholic view, of course, that he is the keeper of the keys of St. Peter, that God communicates to him, and the belief at the time was the Pope was infallible. He gets direct directions from God. The other archbishops said, no, you don't. You are not better than any of the rest of us. The Roman Catholic Church split off, And the Eastern denominations, the Eastern archbishops, the Greek, the Syrian, the Russian later on, Bulgarian, the Copts in Egypt, all of those groups split off of the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, the word didn't exist before 1054. Catholic in Greek is katholiki, which means pure and clean. It didn't mean Catholic like we mean today. So there was one holy Catholic, pure, and apostolic church based on the teaching of the apostles. So you have a big split. East and West, they continue along for another 500 years, and then something very important happens. Martin Luther comes along. He nails his 95 Theses on the door of Wittenberg Cathedral. Okay, if you look at the date of the Lutheran or the Protestant Revolution, you will notice that it is a little bit after 1450 or so, right around that point. What was invented shortly before the Protestant Revolution, something that's crucial to world history? You cannot have the Protestant Revolution without the printing press. Because once you have the printing press, everyone can own their own Bible. And a really good visual interpretation of this, if you look at slide 30, you have the religious breakup of Europe. At the time, you will notice that Spain is all Catholic, Italy is all Catholic. Some places are mixed. France and Germany had mixed. As you go north, you begin to become more and more Protestant, and Luther took over pretty much Northern Europe, all of Scandinavia. But what you have in slides 31 and 33, 31 is the Catholic Cathedral in Seville. Very ornate. This is the high altar in the cathedral. It is absolutely enormous, 200 feet tall. There are something like 475 gold-covered statues on it, all kinds of decoration on it. That's the Catholic Cathedral. If you look at slide 33, you have a Lutheran church in Helsinki, Finland. Notice the difference. The Lutheran church is very, very pretty. They literally blasted it out of a rocky hill. This is a granite outcropping. They blasted the interior out. They made a dome of glass and copper. It's a gorgeous church inside, but the walls, you can still see the blast marks in the walls. Notice the difference between the two. What's on the altar of the Lutheran church? A couple candlesticks, a Bible, a cross. Very plain. Why? Why is the Catholic so ornate and the Protestant one so simple? One word, two words, the Bible. Once they can read the Bible, you don't need the visual cues that the Catholic and the Orthodox Church provided. So when you walk into a Catholic church or an Orthodox church today, you have icons. In the Catholic Church, you have statues. The Orthodox do not. You have decorations. You have all kinds of paraphernalia. Why? Those people did not read. How are they supposed to learn about the Bible? They learned it from the priests. They learned it from the church, and the church is a visual cue to the Bible. So if you look at the altar, everything was very set. The first row were the apostles, and the second row was the great saints of the church, and the third row were the Episcopal church leaders, and the fourth row was something else, and every saint had visual cues. I know a lot about this, actually, oddly enough, because I learned to paint icons when I was in Finland. Icons are not worship, they are representations. They stand for a saint or a holy person. But if you're painting an icon, you have to be very careful what visual clues you put in it. For example, if you have a male saint who's a warrior and he's on a white horse, it's always St. George, because St. George always rides a white horse. You have the same guy on a brown horse, that's St. Demetrius, always rides a brown horse. You have a woman saint who is holding or standing next to a wheel. You know immediately that's St. Catherine, because she was broken and tortured and killed by being put on a wheel. If you have a saint in front of an X-shaped cross instead of the regular cross, having an X-shaped cross, everyone knew immediately that's St. Andrew, because he was crucified on an X-shaped cross. So these are all visual clues. You need a lot of visual clues, and you need active participation of the clergy in the Catholic and Orthodox churches, because they were not literate. Once literacy comes around, as one student wrote very brilliantly on an exam once, you eliminate the middleman. You don't need the interpreter because in Protestantism, you can pick up the Bible and read it yourself. You don't need someone to interpret for you. And that is the huge difference. It changed religious history, it changed European history completely. One of the problems the problem with Catholicism and Orthodoxy is it changes very little, if at all. So if a new idea comes along or a new teaching, it is examined by the church leaders, and if they can incorporate it, they do, and if they don't, they throw it out, and you're a heretic and you're thrown out of the church. The other alternative comes up with Protestantism. Martin Luther had his own interpretation of what the Bible said. Those who followed his interpretation became Protestants. They were protesting against the Church of Rome. They became, of course, Lutherans. But the issue is, once you can interpret the Bible, whose interpretation is it? If I read the Bible and I interpret it differently than you do, then all of a sudden we have, and I can get 200 people to follow me, I have a new religion with a new interpretation. This is still going on today. The Mormon Church is less than 200 years old. It was a different interpretation. Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses. There's a guy in Mexico who claims he's the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, and he has thousands of followers. He has a new religion. So you can start something because it is your interpretation. In the Catholic Church, you can have your own interpretation, but the church validates it or throws you out, one or the other. So this changed everything. That branching tree, I think, is a really interesting analogy for it and a very useful one. I don't care about all the little religions, but the concept of a tree that keeps branching and keeps splitting out, which is what is happening with religion today as well. Okay, moving down to slides 34 and 35. You have a nice little chubby fat guy with a girl and a boy on either side of him. Most of you will recognize that as Henry VIII. Henry VIII comes to the throne in about 1525, 1530 or so, something like that. He marries, oddly enough, his brother's widow. He had an older brother who died very young, at 15 or 16, who had been betrothed at a very young age because they had child marriages then, just to solidify political alignments and political alliances, with a Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon. So his brother dies. Henry marries his brother's widow, Catherine, which was a little odd to us, but not at all odd at the time. She produces a daughter, Mary. 20 years later, Catherine has not produced any other children. Mary is a lovely child, but if you are king, you desperately need, of course, a son. Why do you need a son? Because women were not going to inherit the throne, and particularly Henry VIII, his father had come to the throne by ending the civil wars in England as well. So in order not to create political chaos, Henry needs an heir that clearly will inherit the throne, because nobody wants a woman on the throne. And if you're not going to have Mary, where are you going to go? The next relatives were French princes, and we don't want a French prince on the throne of England. So Henry is now approaching middle age, which at the time was pretty much old age, and he has no male heir, and he's desperate. He decides the solution is to divorce Catherine. He goes to the Pope, asks for a divorce. The Pope says, no, you've been happily married for 20 years, not happening. And the Spanish crown is a big supporter of the Pope, so I'm not going to anger the Spanish monarchy by dumping their daughter back on them. Henry says, okay, I dissolve the Church of Rome. I end Catholicism in England. There will not be any more Catholicism. I will create my own church, which he does, calls it the Anglican Church, Anglican, Angles and Saxons, if you remember, Anglican Church, the Church of England. Today, the Episcopal Church. We still have it in different form, but it's still around, okay? The Anglican Church, the Church of England, pretty much straight off of the Catholic Church, a direct copy of it. The only difference was the Pope is no longer head of the church. Who is head of the church? Big surprise, Henry. Henry appoints himself head of the Anglican Church in England. First thing he does, being a very clever fellow, is he seizes all of the Catholic Church lands in England. This is huge because they owned about a third of the land in England. They are now Henry's property. And he starts parceling them out to all his loyal supporters. So all of a sudden, Henry has a whole lot of loyal supporters on top of it. He doesn't directly attack or destroy the churches. What he did is take the roofs off the churches. Within 20 years, a lot of them were in ruins, which is why when you go to England today, you do have large cathedrals, but a lot of them have been rebuilt and very few were kept. Some of them were turned into Anglican churches, but most all of the monasteries are in ruins today. Henry did that. So he marries Anne Boleyn, who captivated him, and she has a daughter, Elizabeth, and she has a second pregnancy, and the child, which is a boy, is stillborn, born dead. As one of the courtiers said, she has miscarried of her savior. So Henry, at this point, getting older, becoming sick, getting a little desperate at the time, decides, no, I'm going to divorce Anne Boleyn. He's head of the church. He can do that. He doesn't have to ask the Pope. What can he charge her with? He charges her with adultery, which is pretty funny because Henry, of course, was messing around with everybody at court. Was Anne Boleyn? Yeah, she had lovers, but he also charges her with incest, of sleeping with her brother, which she definitely did not. But he needs some pretty strong case. He executes her. She loses her head. He marries Anne Seymour. Anne Seymour has a son and dies shortly thereafter. He would love to have some insurance policy and a second son, and he continues to marry. So you have Henry VIII, the 6 wives of Henry VIII. There's a cute little line about that. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. The last one, Henry died before she did. She was lucky about that. So Henry dies about 1550. Now what? Of course, his son inherits the throne, and his son is only about 11 or 12 at the time and has been from birth a very sickly, not very healthy kid. He dies within about 4 years. Now what? Rather than get a French prince, the ruling class in England decided, okay, we will give it to Mary, the legitimate heir, and also the adult heir, because Elizabeth at this point is also about 10 years old. So Mary becomes queen. Mary was raised as a devout Catholic by her devoutly Catholic mother. What is the first thing Mary does when she becomes queen? Is she begins persecuting Catholics. And this is where you have Bloody Mary. Hundreds were executed. You had to swear loyalty to the Catholic Church and not the Anglican Church. If you didn't, you lost not only your head in many cases or were thrown into prison, which was the equivalent of a death sentence, but you lost your property. Your family was out on the street, and that was probably more important. So many executions in this whole period that I'm not making this up. There was a person whose job at the court in London was titled Keeper of the Heads. And his job was to go around, if somebody lost their head at the Tower of London, if you're ever in London, you really need to go visit it. His job at the Tower of London was to take the heads and put them up on a pike, on a pole at the gates to the city, so everybody could see, don't do this, here's what's going to happen to you. When the head decayed, it was replaced with a new head. So this is the guy who's in charge of rotating the heads on the pikes, basically. This was a full-time job for somebody. So a lot of people are executed. People get really disgusted with Mary. They have lost, the people who had followed Henry are losing their property and their lives. And they put her in the Tower of London. She is not beheaded, but yeah, I think she is beheaded. Anyway, she loses power. And they put Elizabeth on the throne. Elizabeth has been raised as an Anglican by her Anglican mother. She immediately, big surprise, begins persecuting Catholics. So again, people are losing their heads, losing their property, their families have nothing. And Elizabeth is called, her nickname was the Virgin Queen. She never married. She had lots of affairs, so Virgin Queen is pretty hysterical as a nickname. But she rules, she has no heir. She ruled for close to 50 years. By the time Elizabeth leaves the throne, Anglican Church is pretty well established. So what are you going to do? Now who inherits? Catherine had one child, also a daughter, Mary, who was raised, big surprise, Catholic. Not Mary. Mary had one son who was named James. When Elizabeth dies, James inherits the throne. He, of course, also was raised Catholic. He says he's Protestant because he doesn't want civil war, but really he's a Catholic, and he has secret Catholic liturgies in the the palaces that he occupies. He has one son, Charles. Charles is openly Catholic and begins persecuting Protestants. Charles has two sons. His older son, Charles II, Protestant, who is being persecuted Catholics. His brother inherits after about 15 years, and James is Catholic, who is being persecuted Protestants. James had two daughters, Mary and Anne. I don't care about the names. They were both raised Protestant in England. Mary marries William of Orange, a strong Dutch Protestant. And by the time 1700 comes along, England is pretty solidly Protestant, and so is the royal house in England. But for that 150 years, from about 1550 to 1700, what is going on in England? Back and forth, Protestant, Catholic. What religion are you today? You better check and find out who's ruling. Because if you were the wrong religion and openly practicing at the time, you could lose your head, you could be thrown in prison, and lose your property, lose your entire property. So the Catholic Church didn't die out completely, but it is strongly repressed by 1700. It is a small minority in England, and England is strongly Anglican, and they owe their loyalty to whatever the king is. So Henry actually started a revolution and broke up all the church lands in England. From there, we're going to go back to that tree in the next chapter and talk about the Puritans and the Pilgrims and the growing rifts in the Protestant church. But again, the main analogy is a branching tree. If you think of that, it's a really good visual for what is happening to religion in Europe. Stay safe. Have a good day.